Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good night for some of you, perhaps all the way out in Fiji. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today for our launch of the FP2030 measurement report. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Thank you for your patience. Excellent, thank you. And as I said, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, not in the correct order, but that's okay. My name is Jason Bremner, Director for Data and Measurement at FP2030, and I will be moderating and participating in the webinar today. Before we get started, I would like to run through a few logistical notes. So next slide, please. It is great to have all of you with us from around the world. I see we have already more than 100 participants, and people are joining quickly. We have language support, interpretation in French, Spanish, or English, and you can choose the interpretation with the globe button at the bottom of the screen. Please do choose your channel now and avail yourself to the different language support. All participants will be muted for this webinar, and videos will not be enabled. But we do have the chat open to everyone, and so please feel free to use that chat. Please feel free to introduce yourself and tell us where you are joining from today. It's always nice to see all of the global representation that we have. Also, please feel free to use the chat for discussion and conversation between yourselves. If you are asking questions of our participants, please feel free to use the Q&A button or Q&A box that is at the bottom of the screen. Questions and answers can be put in that. We also will, at the end of the presentations, have an opportunity for hearing from our presenters directly. And thank you. I do see people telling me that the chat is not enabled, but we'll work on that and get the chat enabled so you can introduce yourselves. We are recording this session, and the presentations and the recording will be shared with all of you after the webinar. So thank you for your participation. And with that, I would like to introduce our two first speakers. I'd like to introduce first, next slide, please, Dr. Samu Dube, Executive Director of FP2030. And I'd like to introduce Jaime da Silva, Director of USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, who will provide opening remarks for our webinar today. Thank you, Samu, and I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you so much, Jason. So hello, everyone. I hope everyone is having a great day. For us, it's beautiful to have people join from all over the world as we launch our FP2030 measurement report, which actually we've titled Meeting the Moment, Family Planning and Gender Equality. And ladies and gentlemen, our report comes at a very critical time in our movement. We are aware that this universal access to contraception is what we exist for as FP2030, and we do believe that it's something that is important. It's important for us to attain better results when it comes to maternal and neonatal health. We could attain better results when it comes to girls attending education and completing their schooling. We could do more to ensure that women participate in the workforce and they are really part of economic development in various countries in the world. Yet today, globally, 800 women still die every day in childbirth. In fact, the progress that we had made over the years seems to be stalling. 218 million women in low and middle income countries have an unmet need for modern contraception. What does that mean? It means they want to avoid a pregnancy, but they are not using a modern method. Women are already bearing the brunt of our changing climate, and as they care for their families through weather disasters, there is also conflict over strained resources and more. And because of gendered power dynamics, funding for family planning globally remains deprioritized. You will hear more about that in our report. It is difficult to secure and overly politicized amidst shrinking democratic spaces that are threatening achievements in human rights. Now, it is enough for us to just throw our hands up in the air and decide we will focus our attention elsewhere because we feel there are other important things. But I want to just say that will be a mistake of colossal proportions. It's one that the world cannot afford to make because investing in family planning, and you will hear more stories that are coming from the field, stories of success, stories of hope, stories of optimism, but more importantly, some warning signs on why we cannot afford to drop this ball. Investing in family planning, ladies and gentlemen, remains one of the best buys in global health. In fact, it's one of the best buys in global development. It means that countries will see a significant return on investment for their funding they put towards family planning. I just want world leaders to take a pause and realize the potential that we have in front of us to meet this foundational human right. Many people ask, why should we be investing in family planning? I think the starting point is just the right thing to do, but we are seeing more returns on human development if we invest in this foundational human right. There is something that is looming that is around the corner. These are sustainable development goals. It is time for us to be re-energized, to have enough optimism that we can meet this moment. Because there's a good reason for optimism. According to UNFPA, every dollar that you invest in family planning, there are benefits to families, there are benefits to societies, and that's estimated to be at least $8.78. A return, altogether generating about 660 billion in economic benefits by 2050. The Guttmacher Institute, and they are working on many other models for FP impact. They have found that every additional dollar spent investing in family planning would save $3 in reproductive, maternal, newborn, and healthcare costs. Now, ensuring that everyone, everywhere has the ability to decide if and when and how many children they want to have is first and foremost the right thing to do, as I have said. And ensuring that this human right is universal, it is a worthy goal in and of itself. But also actualizing this right, it has significant benefits towards accelerating progress for countries' economies and for entire global communities who want to achieve sustainable development goals. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we all know that contraception is a catalyst for gender equality. And in our report, you will see how we have weaved this ideal into the narrative that we believe that many other leaders who have joined us in this room today would actually follow. Climate change resilience and preparedness would actually be better responded to if we invest in family planning. Economic prosperity would be accelerated if we invest in women, if we invest in family planning. Now, some of you would say, Dr. Dube, where do we start? We start at home. At FP2030, as I've said before, we believe in achieving universal access to contraception as an ideal that is worth living for. We have decentralized our model from a secretariat that was once in Washington, D.C. And this week, I am in Washington, D.C., joined by managing directors who are coming from our 5 regional hubs for the first time, because we believe that if we support countries, if we work together with governments, if every one of us who is in the room, whether you're coming from international NGOs, local civil society, we could join all our hands, hearts, and fit together to ensure we can partner with women, partner with governments to make this ideal come true. The barriers, colleagues, that are faced by women in New Delhi, while similar to a certain extent, they are different than those who are in Nairobi. And it's critical that our organization and yours too have the tools to address these unique contexts. Colleagues, I believe our approach is working. You will see in this report that the modern contraceptive prevalence rate has risen at more than twice the average rate in 6 countries, and naming like Burkina Faso, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Uganda, to just name a few. And this is thanks to the tremendous efforts of funders who have actually supported this ideal, those who work day and night to ensure that products do get to people. Thank you so much for the work that you do. But more importantly, for the governments who have lifted their hands to say, we will make this work for women. We will make this work for our people. MCP has risen by more than 1% point per year since 2012 in these countries. This is remarkable, especially amidst challenges that I've mentioned before of stagnant funding, the lingering disruptions that we still see from COVID-19, the deprioritization of family planning given the wars and conflict that we have today. There are also success stories around contraceptive methods. And again, I am proud to talk about this because somebody made bold decisions in 2012, in 2014, about how you could have implants across the world. In Burkina Faso, for example, implants are the most commonly used method of contraception. It was because of bold, courageous leadership to really take a stand and say, we can solve this problem. And we know that in 11 countries today, implants are the second most commonly used method in another 11 countries as well. It's a story of innovation. It's a story of responsiveness. And I hope to see more stories like this in the coming years, where what women want is matched with what they need. A particular method that works with their lifestyles is quickly scaled up and made available on a large scale. This takes all of us to put all hands on deck to ensure we can meet these ideals. You will hear, ladies and gentlemen, more success stories from my colleagues. More people than ever before are using voluntary rights-based contraception. You will also learn more about the opportunities that we have ahead. But this report that we are launching today and all our data, thanks to our data partners, they show us evidence that we can meet this moment. We don't have much time, but we can meet this moment. And what we need is working together, fostering mutual accountability towards tangible results. So our actions need to lead to those results. It is time to rally for progress. It is time to double down on what we've achieved so far. This is important all over the world. In Bogota, as you know, we are going to be holding our ICFP next year. It's important in Bamako. It's important in Baltimore. It is important all over the world. Indeed, it's an ideal that I hope and I believe everyone who has joined on this call today will believe in and will partner with us, partner with governments, partner with women to ensure we can achieve more. Ladies and gentlemen, women cannot wait. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Samu, and I'll turn it directly over to Shaimi. Thank you, Shaimi, for joining us. And thank you for your
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and thanks, Samu, for that great call to action. Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here on behalf of USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health to celebrate the launch of FP2030's measurement report. I think we can all agree that good data serve as a foundation for our work and are essential to every aspect of our programming. Whether it's directing resources more effectively, planning for commodity needs, or identifying gaps and tracking the progress of family planning programs, robust data are indispensable for making informed decisions and ensuring the delivery of safe, accessible, and high-quality health care. At USAID, our family planning and reproductive health program works with our partner countries to realize a world where ongoing improvements to sexual and reproductive health contribute to longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives for all. Our investments in family planning and reproductive health, coupled with our longstanding partnership with FP2030, are aligned with that vision. So together, our efforts support measurable financial, policy, and programmatic progress towards achieving equitable access to family planning for women and girls worldwide. USAID is actively engaged in supporting FP2030 as it transitions to the governance structure that Samu mentioned, one that fosters country and regional ownership. This includes implementing new guidance and tools to generate robust commitments for family planning, promoting a shared measurement framework for strategy development and progress reporting, advocating for stronger systems of accountability, and forging the kind of diverse and intersectoral partnerships that include high priority areas like adolescent and youth health, climate adaptation, and gender equity and equality. Our partnership with FP2030 also bolsters the effort of these regional hubs in galvanizing the financial and political commitments to family planning and crafting a measurement agenda that's attuned to local needs and contexts. I'm pleased to note that these efforts to regionalize and localize dovetail with key USAID priorities, including locally led development, addressing the needs of a growing youth population, and advancing gender transformative approaches, equity, and sustainable development. In the measurement space, USAID supports FP2030's efforts to collect, disseminate, and utilize data to strengthen family planning programs. And in parallel, we continue to invest in demographic and health surveys and other monitoring, evaluation, and learning projects to facilitate, again, local family planning, reproductive health measurement, and data utilization. Collectively, we all must do more to support measurement innovations that help to identify country-specific measurement priorities and ensure that our monitoring and evaluation agenda is responsive to locally articulated needs rather than solely driven by global imperatives. I'd like to offer my congratulations to Samu and Jason and the FP2030 measurement and evaluation team for launching this comprehensive report. It not only highlights encouraging trends and advancements in family planning and SRH uptake, but it also alerts us to areas of concern that warrant our collective and focused attention. You'll learn more about these trends and gaps as FP2030 walks us through the report's key findings. And I encourage us all to reflect on how we will use these findings to inject data-driven innovation and make strategic investments to advance global progress in family planning and sexual and reproductive health. Thank you so much. And back over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Shaimi. And thank you, Dr. Samu. A pleasure to have both of you open the webinar today. It's incredible to see the global participation that we have, and thank you all for typing in where you're joining us from today. I see at least 5 continents represented there, maybe 6. I'm still looking for someone from Australia or Oceania there. but we've got just about everybody else. Nobody from Antarctica joining us today, but incredible global representation, and it's really great to see that we'll be sharing this widely with all of you. Next slide, please. This year's measurement report builds on a process that we have developed under FP 2020 and continued into FP 2030. And it starts with a measurement framework. You might ask, your first question might be, where do the data in this year's report come from? Our measurement framework was developed in consultation with the Performance Monitoring and Evidence Working Group, a group of independent data and measurement experts from around the world who have assessed and worked with countries to identify aligned, trackable data over time across a host of policy, financing, service, delivery, and individual level indicators. The measurement framework, which is available on our data hub, details the 20+ country indicators and the process for annually reporting on these indicators. Just to remind you, if you have joined us in the past, this is a bottom-up process. Over the course of a year, the Track 20 project at Avenir Health works with countries to aggregate and analyze their data. And in fact, Track 20 and the Track 20 M&E officers, many of whom I see in the chat today, were meeting and training last week in Nairobi to start this process. This process includes then working through all of the data, analyzing and assessing progress, reviewing it locally through consensus meetings before reporting it to the Track 20 project and up to FP 2030. So this is meant to be locally led, your process. It starts with the countries and it ends with this report. We are still, albeit using a similar framework and a similar process, we are still evolving. And this report is different than years past. We have new analysis, new sections. We have regionally led sections, which we'll describe later. We have innovations in finance tracking. And we are launching today a new data dashboard with a host of interactive resources that are available for you to look at your country, to compare your country to others. We do this report for 82 low and lower middle income countries as our starting point, but over time, that was our starting point in 2021. We have added in additional countries as they have either entered into the low and low middle income status category, or if they have made commitments to FP 2030. And I'm happy to report we have several new countries included this year. We are up to 85 reporting countries. With that, I will dive into the highlights of the report. Next slide, please. One of the main things that we see in the report is continued momentum and continued success. Contraceptive use continues to grow, and more women are using modern methods than ever before due to this continued momentum of contraceptive growth and access to contraceptive services. There are over 1 billion women of reproductive age, 15 to 49, across the 85 reporting countries. And an estimated 377 million of those women are now using a modern method of contraception. That's 92 million more women than were using a method in 2012. The next slide will show this graphically. You can see in this slide, looking on the left side, we are looking at total modern contraceptive users from 2012, the left side, to 2023 on the right side. And you can see the upper line that has grown from 285 million in 2012 to 377 million using modern methods in 2023. The difference between those is that 92 million more women using a modern method. Next slide, please. The contraceptive use of those 377 million women results in or averts 141 million unintended pregnancies, 30 million unsafe abortions, and 141,000 maternal deaths in every year. So just in this past year, that contraceptive use has averted all of these unintended pregnancies, unsafe abortions, and maternal deaths. So the impact is incredible. Next slide, please. The increase in contraceptive use is due to two critical factors. One, there are a growing number of women of reproductive age. I mentioned 1 billion women in low and low middle income countries, but that population of women of reproductive age has grown. It's grown by 20% since 2012. So there are more women of reproductive age, and a greater proportion of those women are now using modern methods of contraception. Today, approximately 1/3 of these women, it's actually larger than that, around 35%, are using a modern method. Now, those percentages differ greatly across the countries, and we'll look at that variation in just a minute. As Dr. Samu mentioned, Sub-Saharan Africa has seen the fastest growth in use. So modern contraceptive prevalence has grown 6 percentage points since 2012 across all of Sub-Saharan Africa as an average. But if you look at this country by country, we see that there are some countries that have grown far faster than that. And some of them have grown, or their growth has exceeded 13 percentage points across the entire period, those being Burkina Faso, Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar, Sierra Leone, and Uganda. Next slide, please. So when we think about contraceptive use and contraceptive prevalence growth, we have often described this as an S-curve, where countries may start in a period of very low modern contraceptive prevalence, stage 1, with the right investments, can enter into a period of rapid growth, or stage 2. And as contraceptive use grows and gets to higher levels, the actual growth rate or speed of growth or rate of growth may slow down. And we see countries across the spectrum of this S-curve growth. However, one real notable change is that since 2012, we have had many countries move out of that stage 1 low prevalence area and really move into this stage 2 for this opportunity for growth area. Countries like Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, DR Congo, Mali, and Togo have all moved into this region, or this time of possible rapid growth. And we have also seen countries, as I mentioned, Malawi, Mozambique, Uganda, continue to grow rapidly through this middle stage, stage 2. Investments need to be different in different areas of this, and we will discuss that in a bit in the regional profiles. Next slide, please. One of the dramatic shifts that we have seen over the period and continue to see in this year's data are the shifts in contraceptive method mix. It's occurring across many countries, and it's occurring across regions. Samu mentioned the dramatic shift in the use of implants. Really, we're seeing a dramatic shift in the use of long-acting reversible contraceptives. And a particular success story is the Implant Access Project, which reduced costs of implants, trained providers in insertions and removals, and worked a lot on community awareness about long-acting reversible contraceptive methods. In 2012, implants were the most common method in only one country, and that was Burkina Faso. And today, implants are the most common method in 11 countries and the second most common method in another 16 countries. And we'll take a look at that in a graphic in just a moment. But there are other notable trends and other shifts occurring. There are shifts occurring among injectable users. We are seeing signs of increases or shifts from DMPA IM or intramuscular to DMPA SC, subcutaneous. We are seeing signs of increases in emergency contraceptive use, and we are seeing slow declines in traditional use, but it is still prominent in many countries. And I want to remind you that we do report on all methods, method mix, as well as traditional methods in the measurement report and in the full data tables. Next slide, please. I did mention that we are launching our interactive dashboard today, and you will see some screen grabs and images from that dashboard. You can look at the most common method and second most common method by country in the dashboard. And here I am showing the most common method, implants, which are emerging in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in a few countries in South Asia. Next slide, please. It's not all roses, and there are some important warning signs that we are beginning to see in the data. I'll remind you that during the period of COVID, many of the surveys were postponed. And we did not have a lot of survey data from 2020 and 2021. We are now starting to see the return to regular surveys, and we have now had 12 new surveys come in the post-COVID period. And this year, we were absorbing a lot of new data. After these postponed surveys, we were wondering about progress because it had been in some countries more than 5 years since we'd had a survey. And unfortunately, we are seeing in several countries some signs of slowing or slower than anticipated growth. Countries such as Honduras, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Tanzania are a few examples of countries that really wanted to see, have made commitments to family planning and wanted to see greater progress, but we're seeing either signs of differential subnational progress, even at a national level, less progress than anticipated. And so this is something that we are diving into deeply. There are also concerns about those countries that have come out of the lowest levels of prevalence and have entered into the period of possible rapid growth. That continued growth requires new investments. It requires key investments in the high-impact practices that will allow them to continue that progress and continue to meet needs of different women and girls and adolescents and youth. And postpartum family planning and post-abortion family planning are two critical high-impact practices that we need to continue to look at and that we have looked at over this past year. We will dive into in our regional profile section in a few minutes more on the opportunities in maternal healthcare and family planning integration and missed opportunities and potential opportunities that can be invested in there. And I think as we lead into the next section of the report, we will dive into this more deeply. There are concerns about the financing of family planning, and whether the financing of family planning is going to be commensurate with the growing needs of the growing number of women and their growing desire to use modern contraception. Next slide, please. So with that, we will dive into the finance section. I'll be sharing this section with colleagues of mine, but I'll do a first few opening slides on the total expenditures and total financing for family planning. We will then review financing on donor disbursements for family planning, as well as domestic expenditures on family planning. Next slide, please. So our family planning finance tracking also began in 2012. It is led by the International FP Expenditure Tracking Working Group, led by Track 20, and thank you to my colleagues who are online today from that group. We assess a total FP financing landscape. We report on total FP expenditures and component parts of donor government financing, country domestic expenditures, and consumer or out-of-pocket spending. This year's report provides more context on how the FP2030 report relates to other important RMNCAH resource tracking efforts. And we also have done more this year on domestic expenditures than ever before. And so there's some nice innovations. If you have gotten used to the report and think you've seen all that we've done, I urge you to dive a little bit deeper this year because there is far more data on financing this year than in years past. Next slide, please. This is a graphic that I encourage you to look at more carefully in the report. It shows our total expenditures on family planning at $4 billion US. They're in the top number in the middle. And you can see that that is made up of out-of-pocket or consumer spending of about $700 million, approximately $1.6 billion in domestic government expenditures, and $1.6 billion in international donor funding. Now, our report is not just commodities, so I want to be clear that we are capturing more than commodities. And you might ask, how does our tracking relate to other reports and other tracking? You will see in this graphic, we've tried to lay out how our report compares to and relates to our colleagues and other reports that will come out very soon. I'm happy to report that we work very closely with these other colleagues and other partner organizations. The Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition will soon launch their LEAP report. Our colleagues from DSW will soon launch their Donors Delivering for SR-HR report. And so we look at this with similar eyes. We coordinate our efforts, but we often look at different components. And so this will help you to understand where our report lies within the continuum of different reports. We're going to dive into the component parts. And with this, next slide, please. I am going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Adam Wexler, Associate Director, Global Health and HIV Policy, and Director of the Global Health Budget Project, to cover donor government funding for family planning in 2022. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Jason, and hello to everyone joining us here today. As Jason mentioned, my name is Adam Wexler. I work at KFF on our Donor Government Funding for Family Planning project. Today, I'm going to cover highlights from our most recent report being released today as well, which highlights totals from 2022. Next slide, please. So what we found in this year's report is that donor government funding for family planning was $1.35 billion in 2022, which, as you saw on the previous slide, accounted for approximately 1/3 of total available resources in low and middle income countries, which was $4 billion. The funding amount that we found in 2022 represented a decline of about 9%, or $129 million, compared to the 2021 total, which was $1.48 billion. And this year, the 2020 total was the lowest amount since 2016, which was $1.31 billion. I'm going to cover some details of what caused those declines a little bit later, but continuing here, what we found is that the majority of donor government funding was provided bilaterally, and that totaled 1.3 billion or 96%. The remainder, which was approximately 50 million, slightly more, was 4% of the overall total, and was for multilateral contributions to UNFPA's core resources. And that is not the full amount that donors provide for core resources. This is an adjusted amount for an estimated family planning share. I want to thank our colleagues at UNFPA who worked with us to come up with this estimate. Next slide, please. And what you see here is the amounts that we've been tracking over the last decade. And so what you can see following the 2012 summit is that funding increased for several years before declining. Now, an important point about the declines in 2015 and 16, while there were actual declines, a large share of that was due to the rise of the US dollar globally. In fact, when you take into account those exchange rate fluctuations, funding was relatively flat. Then again, funding increased slightly in the subsequent years after the 2017 summit before dropping more recently. And again, I'll get into more details about this year's decline in just a bit. Next slide, please. So what this slide demonstrates is the funding by channel from the donor governments. And it has each of the donor governments we highlight. And as you can see here, the majority of funding from all the donor governments is provided bilaterally. But there are some differences among some of the donors, with several choosing to provide a larger share than others through the multilateral efforts or the core contribution to UNFPA. Next slide, please. So let's get to the decline in 2022. The decline was due to decreased bilateral funding from most donor governments. Multilateral support increased slightly, but not enough to compensate for the bilateral declines. However, similar to 2015 and 16, the rise of the US dollar globally in 2022 actually accounts for 2/3 of the bilateral decline. So if you hold the exchange rates constant between 21 and 22, you see that a large portion of that, 2/3, is the result of that rise in the US dollar. However, some donors did decline, and several attributed their declines to budgetary pressures associated with the humanitarian response to Ukraine. The US and UK have consistently been the top bilateral donors over the period. But when you remove these donors and look at the funding from the other donor governments, you see that their amounts have generally risen, although there have been fluctuations. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is the difference in funding between 22 and 21. And what you can see here is that the Netherlands and Norway increased, the US remained flat, and all other donor governments declined. Again, it's important to point out that if it wasn't for the exchange rate fluctuations, as we converted our totals to US dollars, the declines would be much smaller, and actually the increases by Netherlands and Norway would be larger. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is the point I made earlier with highlighting the US in the top bar, the green bar. As you can see here, the funding has been flat from the US over the period. The bottom bar, the lighter blue bar, is the UK, and you can see there's been fluctuations over the period, but declines in recent years, which we all anticipated here in reports. But then that middle bar, the darker bar, shows the funding from the other donor governments. And as you can see, that funding has generally risen over the period. Next slide, please. So as we saw previously throughout on that previous chart, the US has been the largest donor over the period and continued to be in 2022, accounting for 43% or almost $600 million of the total funding from donor governments. The Netherlands was the second largest donor government, accounting for 16%. And it's important to note that this is the first year that this has occurred. All previous years, it was the UK was the second largest donor. But the UK followed after the Netherlands, accounting for 13%, Sweden at 9%, and Canada at 7%. Now, one other way to measure how donors are contributing to the overall effort, besides the absolute amount, is to look at the amounts provided and standardize them by the size of their economies. So how much family planning funding is provided per million GDP. And when we did this exercise, we found that Netherlands ranked first, followed by Sweden and the UK, and the US was ranked 7th. Next slide, please. This is a graphic representation of the overall totals in 2022. And as you can see again here, the US is the largest, followed by the Netherlands, the UK, and Sweden. Next slide. And then this is a representation of that other measure I mentioned, which is standardizing the family planning funding by the size of a donor's economy, or $1 million of GDP. And what we see here is that the Netherlands and Sweden far outpace the other donor governments. And with that, I have given a lot of information, so I look forward to questions later, and I'll hand it back to Jason. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm just going to, as I mentioned earlier, provide a bit of context on our donor expenditures, on our domestic expenditures for family planning, before we dive back into some country family planning data. So for those of you who have been with us for a while, you may remember that in 2018, FP2030 published its first table on domestic expenditures on family planning in 36 countries. And we used a variety of data sources, working with a host of partners, including Avenir Health, UNFPA, WHO System of Health Accounts, and individual governments who provided reporting. Today, we are reporting on family planning domestic expenditures in 61 of those 85 countries. And I'm happy to report that this year marks the first year in which FP2030 and Track 20 are publishing multi-year trends for domestic expenditures and are providing details on components of those domestic expenditures. I'm going to show you what that looks like through an example from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I encourage you to explore our data set to look at these trends, to look at the component parts. As I mentioned at the outset of the financing section, 1.6 billion, or about the same amount as is provided by donors overall, is provided by country governments. Now, not all country governments contribute the same amount. We have some that are contributing huge amounts, large countries funding almost their entire programs domestically, and some countries that are still largely working with donor support, but are also contributing domestically. Let's take a look at Democratic Republic of Congo in the next slide. So this graphic is coming from our dashboard and shows you for Democratic Republic of Congo, the domestic expenditures on family planning. And when I say domestic expenditures, this is domestic expenditure coming from Treasury, coming from their own accounts. And this shows 2020, 2021, and 2022. And you can see in the DRC an increasing domestic expenditure on family planning, now 12 million in 2022. We can look at the detail of the most recent year. So next slide, please. And I can see that in the question and answer, Emily Sonneville just provided this, but this country expenditure data is collected in country through a methodology called a family planning spending assessment. And that family planning spending assessment allows us to look at different components of that domestic expenditure. And depending on the country, this can look very different. You can explore all of this in our dashboard and in the data set. Here in 2022, you can see that DRC expenditure on family planning was largely focused on personnel. Okay, that's the healthcare providers who are giving the service. And you can see capital costs, program management. And in this case, you can see commodity spending, a small a very small, negligible amount here, suggesting that commodities are being supported through other partners in DRC in 2022. Now, this can fluctuate year to year, so it allows us to see in trends what are the components that are fluctuating. So I urge you to explore this data in more depth. Next slide, please. So this all gives us a sense of challenges. It gives us a sense of FP financing and whether the FP financing is commensurate to the need. We see that donor giving may not be increasing, but we have heard about an increasing number of women of reproductive age and increasing service needs. So my colleague, Shiza Farid, our data analyst at FP2030, will take us through the next sections of the report. Thank you. Over to you, Shiza.
Thank you, Jason. And hi, everyone. My name is Shiza Farid, and I'm the Senior Data Analyst for the FP2030 team. I will be presenting on key top-line findings from our regional profile section. And what I share today is just a brief snapshot of a larger analysis that is found in the report. So I encourage you all to review the complete section with the accompanying visualizations. Next slide. So what did our analysis explore? Every year, we aim to review themes that allow us to understand the opportunities to meet women's contraceptive needs, regardless of where they are in their reproductive life journey. We also work with our hubs to understand areas that countries themselves want to review data for. And as Jason mentioned in his remarks, there are over 1 billion women of reproductive age in low and lower middle income countries. And in 2023 alone, there were over 95 million births. This population of women entering reproductive years is growing, and so are the number of births that are occurring annually. And as girls enter their reproductive years and start planning their futures, and when women start to plan their families, they should have access to contraception to meet their needs and their specific needs. So in this year's regional profile section, we focus on the links between maternal health and family planning. And in the section, we provide an overall demographic update, which provides an update on the total population of women of reproductive age, fertility rates, total number of births, median age of the population, modern contraceptive use, and most common methods used in the different regions. We also review family planning used in 40+ countries, and we review this in the context of pregnancy risk and spacing between births. Specifically, we analyze how postpartum modern contraceptive use differs based on the place of delivery, the age of mother when she delivered her baby, and whether she was married or not when she had her first child. We also explore health system level indicators, such as timing of postnatal checks and the content of these checks to identify patterns and suggest opportunities for improvement. And I'll note up front, for the postpartum family planning analysis, we only include profiles for 3 regions: East and Southern Africa, Northwest Central Africa, and Asia Pacific, due to data limitations in Latin America and the Caribbean. So let's review some of these findings. Next slide. We will start with a quick overview of key demographic estimates for 2023. For many of you in this webinar, this is not surprising. Asia is the most populous region in the world, but the rate of its population growth is slowing. Meanwhile, Africa's regions have rapidly shifting dynamics, where we have East and Southern Africa, which is growing the fastest, but Northwest Central Africa is more populous than East and Southern Africa. And within Northwest Central Africa is the youngest region, with over 50% of its population being 16 or under. In terms of contraceptive use and fertility patterns, Eastern Asia has the highest modern contraceptive prevalence at 60%, and Central Africa has the lowest at 17% among all women. Asia has subregions where fertility rates are below replacement level, below 2.1, whereas all of Latin America and Caribbean is below replacement level, and none of Africa's regions are below this 2.1 level. So very different demographic profiles of the regions I cover. Next slide. For the postpartum family planning analysis, the main takeaways are presented here. I will go through each of them in the subsequent slides, but in general, what did our analysis suggest? It should suggest that prompt postnatal checks are critical. The place of delivery should not determine the types of services women are receiving. Regardless of a woman's age, tailored counseling and services should be provided. And differential postpartum family planning use by marital status at birth and age at birth should be explored as possible signs of gender-based barriers. Let's go through the first finding. Next slide. Women in the early postpartum period have little risk of pregnancy. However, at this time, this is when they should be counseled on their options and provided services, because some women might opt to use immediate postpartum family planning. Yet too many women are unprepared for the return of fertility because they were not offered family planning services. And in several of the countries that we reviewed, we saw a pattern of unhealthy birth spacing, meaning many of the women were having 2 births within 24 months of each other. Our analysis found that prompt postnatal care checks vary greatly by region. In East and Southern Africa, most women do not receive these prompt checks after delivery, whereas North and West Central Africa, at least a third of the women do. In Asia and Pacific, most of these women receive prompt checks. And in every region, we reviewed current modern contraceptive prevalence is higher for women who received prompt postnatal care checks compared to women who either never received a postnatal care check or received very delayed checks. And we assume that these prompt checks are a proxy for how responsive a health system is to the needs of women. If you look to the graphic on the right, this represents the situation in Senegal. On the y-axis, you have modern contraceptive prevalence in the postpartum period, and on the x-axis, you have months since delivery. So here you will see month 1 through month 12, a full year. And on this slide, we will just focus on the dark blue line on top and the light purple shaded section from month 1 to month 6. The dark blue line on top represents the women's insusceptibility to pregnancy in the postpartum period, the full year. So in the early postpartum period, around month 1 since giving birth, nearly 100% of women in Senegal are not susceptible to a pregnancy. This could be because women are not having sex or their menstrual cycles have not returned. However, in most countries and in Senegal, a significant proportion of women become susceptible to pregnancy as time continues, as we'd expect. The shaded area indicates a time-bound opportunity between month 1 and month 6 in the postpartum period for country programs to provide contraceptive counseling and services. These services should be provided soon after delivery and when a woman returns to the clinics for checks for her baby or herself. Next slide. The second finding was that the place of delivery should not determine the types of services a woman is receiving, but in many countries it might be. In all 3 regions, women who have home births consistently have lower modern contraceptive prevalence in the postpartum period. Some countries also show a difference in modern contraceptive uptake, depending on if the births were in public or in private facilities. Looking again to the graphic on the right, which is the same graphic as the previous slide, we are sticking with Senegal as the example. And again, there are visuals for 40+ countries in the full analysis that can be looked at by going to the regional profile section of the report. So again, just on this graphic for Senegal, we have already discussed the dark blue line. Now we can focus our attention to the yellow, orange, and green lines. All 3 lines indicate postpartum modern contraceptive uptake from month 1 to month 12 after delivery. The yellow line is for women that delivered in the public facility. The orange is for women that delivered in private facilities, and the green is among women that delivered at home. In Senegal, modern contraceptive uptake is relatively low at month 1 after delivery. However, differences in uptake start to emerge around month 3 and continue to month 12. Consistently, women that delivered in a private facility have higher uptake than women that delivered in a public facility. Additionally, as you see with the green line, women that deliver at home have the lowest uptake, and it barely increases over the year in the postpartum period. Other countries in the report where you could see similar patterns include Ethiopia in East and Southern Africa, Mali and Niger in Northwest Central Africa, and Afghanistan in Asia Pacific. Next slide. The third finding is that counseling and services should be provided to women regardless of their age at birth. But again, there are some opportunities for improvement. Postpartum contraceptive uptake differs by age in several countries. In some countries, the youngest mothers, those under 20, are being left behind, where in other countries, 35 or older women are left behind. But to avoid unintended pregnancies in the postpartum period for either of these age groups, women at all ages need to be counseled and provided services. However, some regional patterns emerged from our analysis that should be addressed. In East and Southern Africa, postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence was lowest among the oldest mothers, 35 or older, in many of the countries we reviewed. In Asia Pacific, we saw modern contraceptive prevalence gaps between the youngest and oldest mothers that widened over time. For example, we saw this in the Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan. In Northwest Central Africa, we saw consistent wide gaps in postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence between the youngest and oldest mothers. And we saw this, for example, in Nigeria and Senegal. So different patterns are emerging across different regions and countries. To the right, you see the graphic again for Senegal. The three lines are modern contraceptive uptake in the postpartum period. The blue line is for mothers that are under age 20, and you can see that it is consistently low in the postpartum period for these young women. The two lines for women 20 or older are overlapping, meaning similar use patterns among women that are above age 20. Next slide, so we can move to our last finding, which was differential modern contraceptive prevalence uptake based on marital status and age should be explored as possible signals of gender-based barriers. In the previous slide, we saw differences by age, and on this slide, we will focus on marital status at first birth. In several countries, postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence is higher among women who had their first birth outside of marriage than those that had their first birth within marriage. In other countries, it is lower among women who gave birth outside of marriage. In countries where postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence is lower among women who gave birth outside of marriage, could this be an indicator that family planning services are not readily available for unmarried women, who oftentimes also tend to be younger in many places? Or in places where postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence is higher among women who had their first birth outside of marriage, could this possibly signal less autonomy for women in their reproductive decision-making if they are married? We don't know the answers to those two questions, but they can be further explored. But what we do know by looking at our analysis is there are several regional differences. In East and Southern Africa, in 7 out of the 14 countries reviewed, there were no differences in postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence by marital status at first birth, which is great. However, in the other 7 countries reviewed, there were country-specific differences. In Northwest Central Africa, most of the countries reviewed, the 12 out of 14, postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence was higher among women that gave their first birth outside of marriage. And the similar pattern exists in the majority of countries reviewed in Asia Pacific, where in 5 out of 9 countries, postpartum modern contraceptive prevalence was higher among first births outside of marriage. So I'll stop here and I'll say that I just very briefly shared top-line findings from the regional profile section. There's additional country level data and visualizations, and I hope you find the time to review them in detail. Thank you for letting me walk through our analysis, and I will turn it back over to Jason. Next slide.
Thank you, Shiza. As you can tell, as we add more countries, more themes, and more data, it becomes more complicated to give you a large summary and highlights from the report. That's exactly what we're hearing from our opening speakers, that ultimately This is about working with countries. It's about working locally to understand the data. And so when we work towards a global report, I hope you'll understand that, again, this should be a bottom-up process, and this should be just a capstone where we bring all that data together. I encourage you to dive into the resources that I'll show you in just a moment here. Explore your country data, explore the increasing number of regional comparison tools that we have available to you. And please feel free to come back to us with questions. Please ask those questions here. We have about 20 minutes where we can answer questions. I see lively discussions going on. I'll walk you through a couple of resources that we have available, and as you start to write down additional questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. This one. So we did release all of our data in this data set in December 2023. We do try to have that data out in the year in which it is aggregated and gathered. This year's report does include, as I mentioned earlier, 4 new countries: Botswana, Jordan, Lebanon, and Namibia. You can find a full data file with updated country family planning indicator data, with adolescent and youth data. And you can also find Track 20 country data briefs all on our country and data resources page. These are the tiles that you will see when you go visit that page. You will also find new data, our new data dashboard with additional visuals. I'll show a few of those. Next slide, please. This will be the entry page into your dashboard, where you can find opportunities for looking at country reports, at finance data, at intra-regional comparison. So you can go into a region and compare countries. You can look at adolescent and youth data by country. Next slide, please. If you were to go to an individual country, you can select, or individual country page, you can select that country and see many different indicators over time. This showing some trend data for total number of users, modern contraceptive prevalence, traditional contraceptive prevalence, where it is greater than 5% of the method mix, and other data. And next slide, please. And you can also look at comparisons or trends over time using what many of you know as motion charts or motion bubble charts, once called a Gapminder or Trendalizer. So we have lots of opportunities for you. I hope you will explore those. We look forward to feedback on this as we enter into our next phase of building out the dashboard and getting ideas from you about what you would like to see. So with that, I hope you have thought about and added some more questions and we will try to answer those, or questions, into the Q&A pod or into the chat. I have had colleagues collecting those over time. So with that, we are going to start a couple of live answers of these, and I'm going to pull up my cheat sheet here as I look at some of the questions. While we're getting warmed up here, I did see some questions about the availability of the domestic expenditure data. And I could open this up. Emily Sonnefeld, if you want to unmute and just say a word about the availability of data over on the Track 20 website, I welcome you to unmute yourself and say hello. Not sure if Emily can do that. Just checking here. Okay, she's not somewhere where she can unmute today. She's probably like me in New York, but I found a quiet space. No worries, Emily. I know the answer, so I will fill in for you. And the domestic expenditure data are available through family planning spending assessment reports. Those are over on the Track 20 website. So everything that we collect is publicly available. You can go through those reports. You can see the component expenditures that I mentioned. They also have a great interactive data tool over there where you can see and visualize those, as well as at our FP2030 data dashboard. And we've worked carefully and collaboratively to make sure that those are showing the same data, mirroring one another. And so thank you, Emily and team that is on here today participating who work on that. There was a great question, Adam, about distinguishing between bilateral funding and multilateral funding, and where do global USAID projects like the Momentum Project, where do they fall?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So basically, when we collect data, the bilateral totals are any FP-specific amount as designated by the donor government. So USAID funding, if it's going to a specific project, that would be considered bilateral funding. If a donor government is giving funding to a multilateral organization that is specifically dedicated for FP, so for instance, a donor contribution to UNFPA supplies, that would also be considered bilateral. And then the multilateral component is strictly the donor government's core contributions to UNFPA that has been adjusted based on information we've been given by UNFPA to an FP share. So a donor government might be giving $50 million to UNFPA, but then only a portion of that is considered FP. So those are the two components. So hopefully I've answered that clearly, but if there's additional questions on those points, I'm happy to take further.
Great, thanks, Adam. So largely the sort of USAID projects, those are all, unless they're at a UNFPA or a multilateral institution, those are going to show up as bilateral funding.
That's
for family.
Correct. Yes.
And that would be similar. So, you know, if somebody here knows like a UK FCDO Dreams project, again, we're talking about bilateral funding for family planning.
Correct.
Okay. Thanks for helping people understand that better. And thanks for all the efforts to capture the bilateral, multilateral differently this year. I know you didn't totally say that this has been a process, but probably owe a thanks to UNFPA who have helped with that process as well.
Yes, that's a very good point. For those that have seen our prior reports, we had treated the UNFPA funding separately, just the core contributions, highlighted those amounts. But again, thanks to our UNFPA colleagues, we work with them to get that estimate of how much of that funding is going to FP specifically, so we can give a more well-rounded picture of that FP total from each donor government, because some donor governments give a lot to UNFPA, and we wanted to make sure that they were getting that amount included in their overall total. So yes, again, just one more time, thank you to our UNFPA colleagues, and it is something that we were working towards for some time, and appreciate being able to do that.
Thanks, Adam. All right, working through some additional questions here. There was a question, Shiza, I want to turn to you on this one. There was a question about, we were talking about the number of women of reproductive age and whether you could apportion that to within that the number of adolescents. I saw that you did answer that in the chat, but I thought it would be just good for you to say a little bit about the adolescent and youth data that are available. We didn't highlight that here today, but I know you know that data really well. Do you want to say a word about what is available and what people can find in the adolescent youth data?
Yes, I'm happy to share. So in the link to the dashboard that has been shared a few times in the chat, there is a tab for adolescents and youth. And on that tab, you will find country level data for key life events, age at first birth, marriage, sex, as well as key indicators around family planning use among the 15 to 19-year-olds, as well as those that are 20 to 24. So we do report this data annually. It is from surveys, so it is not available for all countries, but where the data surveys are available, we do update this every year.
Thanks, Shiza. And so this year you can also find all of that data in the dashboard. a great resource. Before, it was kind of tied up in a large Excel file. We recognize that not everybody loves an Excel file like my team. And so we have visualized a lot of those graphics for you all. So thanks, Shiza. Okay, we're going to start diving into some additional questions. There was a question here on a recent, or there was, I wouldn't say it was a question, but a note on a recent commentary, or it was a commentary in DevX questioning the impact of postpartum family planning in Africa. Thank you, Ann Stars, for noting that. I have definitely read that, as have most of my team. And we have one of our colleagues who's not on the webinar, who is actually working on a response to that commentary, working on a response in the Q&A pod right now, but I wanted to definitely take this one on directly as well. I encourage you all to read the commentary. I think the commentary was written by a young professional who received some seed funding to work on a postpartum family planning service delivery or scale-up project in Ghana. At the end of a year, the individual working with the institution evaluated their results, and they determined that they did not think their effort warranted continued investment, and they chose to stop the program and wrote a commentary about the results and about the value of postpartum family planning. I'll be honest that I don't think that single project, small scale, really reflects our experiences, our own estimation of the possible impact, and for that matter, the objective of what I think most people in our space are working on in postpartum family planning. They surmised that postpartum family planning would have little impact on reduction of unintended pregnancies. And I think you heard clearly in Shiza's presentation that our focus is on the rights of all women and girls, regardless of where they are in their journey of motherhood or parenthood, to have a right to the services, to the information that they need, and that this should not be a focus on just reducing unintended pregnancy. So with that in mind, we are writing a commentary or working with colleagues in the Ministry of Health in Ghana. So that is our thoughts on that. I'd love to hear other people's comments. Feel free to write in the chat. We really may be actually just handing over the opportunity for a comment to the government that's working in Ghana, that's working on that program, postpartum family planning program there. We do think that's the real opportunity, is for them to respond. Postpartum family planning is in a lot of the commitments to FP 2030, so we will continue to see this as an opportunity, but love to hear others' thoughts on this. All right. Others that want to respond from my team, if you want to, you can come off mute and say a word on that one. Okay. I am seeing another question that is from colleague Lester Coutinho. Good to see you, Lester, and thanks for your question. In terms of the S-curve of growth, where does the private sector, what is the role of the private sector relative to public sector in that acceleration or that arc? That's a great question. And I would love for Emily to come on and answer that, but I'm not sure she is available. I will keep an eye on the chat. And Emily, I encourage you, I can probably reopen that question. You can type in there as well. But I think it's quite clear that as countries transition out of that lowest prevalence period or stage 1 of the S curve, that a variety of service delivery options are necessary to continue through a stage or that stage 2 of rapid growth, and that the private sector does play a critical role. And they can play a critical role in the move out from stage 1 to stage 2 if the public sector isn't yet ready to deliver services at large scale. But in that stage 2 critical component, I'll remind you that we do have the source of contraceptive method, public versus private, as one of our key country indicators. So we encourage countries to look at that data, to track it over time. It is unfortunately only available from our survey data, so it is not available or does not change year to year, but we do encourage countries to look at that, and particularly look at it by method. Increasingly, you need to understand the method mix, you understand the service delivery channels for those methods, and I encourage a look at that. So a critical component, and I do see one of my colleagues from Track 20 is also typing an answer in to you, Lester, as well. Shiza, there is a question. It's actually in French, but I think you'll understand it. And it is about modern methods versus traditional methods and being specific. Can we be specific about the traditional methods and what's included among those? You want to answer that?
Sure, happy to. Traditional methods are withdrawal as well as periodic abstinence, and then any country-specific folkloric or herbal method. That is what we count as traditional. So everything else is considered modern. So, for example, lamb is a modern method, standard days, those are a modern method in our data aggregations.
Do you want to say a word about some of the trends you've seen in traditional method use as you've looked at this data over time?
Well, we do report on traditional methods for countries where the prevalence is higher than 5% among married women. You would think that it is not a large group of women, but it's over 80 million women still rely on traditional methods worldwide. And it is, in some countries, it is as high as 1 in 10 married women are relying on a traditional method. And while it might not be increasing at the aggregate level for a country, we have seen increases within certain regions of a country. So not to be ignored, to be evaluated. And some of these women might be using them as their preferred method. So no judgment on what's right or wrong. They should have access to both.
Thank you, Shiza, for filling in more about that. Okay, let's see. I am just looking across here. There was a question about Latin America, general question about data for Latin America. I will say that we have limited number of countries from Latin America represented in our data set. So I mentioned 85 countries. There are about 6 countries from Latin America, and you might ask why. It is because of that initial criteria, which is we started with the idea of reporting for low and low middle income countries. That set of countries closely resembled the 69 countries that we focused on under FP 2020. It was an easy transition into FP 2030 to make that decision. I think it's questionable whether that's the right or wrong decision, but it was a manageable one from a data perspective. We are working on reconsidering that with our regional hub teams and understanding what more we could do, particularly in Latin America and in Asia Pacific, where I should say Latin America and the Caribbean, sorry, and Asia Pacific, where there are many countries in the upper middle income category. Someone asked specifically about Venezuela and data and details on Venezuela. We do not include Venezuela currently. Interestingly, the World Bank currently leaves Venezuela out of its income categories. We do not have family planning data available for Venezuela at this point in time. I will say it's an important country for the rest of the region, as migration from Venezuela or out of Venezuela is prevalent throughout Latin America and Caribbean. And I was just in Panama last week, and we are talking about how we capture these points in our annual reporting. And I don't have an easy answer to that at this moment in time. But thank you for the question, and we will continue to build out our data resources for these regions, and particularly in the run-up to the International Family Planning Conference, which Dr. Samu mentioned will be in Bogota, Colombia in 2025. And I'm very much looking forward to being there and highlighting data. Okay, we only have time for another question or two. Thanks to my colleagues who've answered them in the chat or in the Q&A. I see someone asked about PPFP data for Madagascar, and we were able to answer that. Generally, our PPFP data or postpartum family planning data does come from demographic health surveys. So that is our best resource. We do encourage, and we are working on an effort to monitor postpartum family planning through HMIS data at a country level. Countries are doing that differently, and we have a whole effort underway to support countries to think through what they're measuring in antenatal, postnatal care registers, and so lots of opportunity there. I do see a question about figures on the efficacy and failure of traditional methods. We tend to rely on standard resources for studies for the efficacy and failure of methods. One of my colleagues can put that link, if they're able to get to it quickly, in the chat. So Guttmacher Institute has published on this, and colleagues at Guttmacher have published on this, and those are the figures we use. Maybe a last question here. Do we have unique observations to FP access in countries with heightened humanitarian situations? We have a colleague who does work on family planning, emergency preparedness, resilience and response. It is very difficult to collect family planning data that is publicly accessible in those situations. So something that we have worked on for a long time, and that we're very passionate about, in the memory of our colleague Jen Schlecht, who was our first director of emergency preparedness and response, and who really sought that data. We'll continue to work towards that, Stephen. I see your question about it. Not an easy one, and UNFPA is a key partner in looking at that. But thank you for the question. There are service statistics available from many partners, and we have tried to look at that in the past. So I do see continued questions coming in, and I'm sorry that we can't cover all of them. We are at time on this webinar, 90 minutes. It seems to fly by, and it never seems to be enough. But I think we can all agree that 90 minutes is about right for sitting at your desks and listening to a webinar. So what should you do? Please feel free to reach out to us. Ask us through our regional hubs, through country focal points, through Track 20 M&E officers, more about data. What services can we provide to you? What analysis? Our Track 20 colleagues are obviously available for this as well. And I just want to thank everyone who contributes to this annual process of putting together a measurement report, reviewing data, using that data to assess progress and determine priorities. It's a privilege to work with all of you. a privilege to serve you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in 2024. Thank you to Dr. Samu, to Shaimi, to Adam and Shiza for the webinar, and thank you to all of the FP 2030 and Track 20 support staff for working towards this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, and I hope you all have a blessed day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.